Okay, so welcome to lecture 16, which is the last lecture on Mill. As you know, the main item on the agenda for today is the harm principle, which in condensed form says the only purpose for which a power can rightly be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That principle Mill places at the center of his argument on liberty, because he believes that following that principle is a liberty-promoting policy. And later on in the lecture, I'm going to explain what I think the harm principle means, how Mill thinks it should be applied, and what sort of implications it has in different kinds of areas of public policy, because there's lots of I think, misunderstanding of the principle, and that's going to be our main concern. But we have a little bit of unfinished business from the previous lecture, because I had not completely finished reviewing Mill's utilitarian arguments for the value of the liberties that he thinks the harm principle will, if followed, protect. I talked about some of these. I talked about his argument for the value of open and free discussion and debate as a common resource on which we all depend for the capacity to improve and develop the rationality of our own beliefs, opinions, and commitments. One thing that we talked about, and Mill clearly thinks that that's a utilitarian argument for the value of free discussion. We talked about the utility of error. Mill thinks, as I think most utilitarians would have to think, that human progress depends on human beings, both socially and individually, learning from their mistakes. But we're only going to be able to learn from mistakes if we let people make those mistakes. Without seeing the results of those mistakes, we won't be in a position to fully appreciate why they're mistakes and what we should take away from seeing them happen. And so that, in general, Mill thinks is an argument for leaving people free to make the mistakes that we need people to make in order to progress individually and as a society. So that much we covered. But there's also another strand of argument that I want to just introduce, which has to do with the dangers of conformism and the way in which conformism, mindless acquiescence in the conventional nostrums and dogmas of your day, threatens individual well-being. Right, and this, of course, very, very closely connects up with his arguments about the higher pleasures in his book, in his little essay on utilitarianism, which we talked about last week. Mill thinks that we are better off as individuals to the extent that we set ourselves higher ideals and goals to strive for. And among the most important of these is the search for truth, the search for honesty, and the search for personal authenticity. And Mill in general thinks that there is absolutely no reason to suppose that the beliefs that you are asked, and not even just asked, but in a way compelled to accept as part of your socialization, there's absolutely no general reason to think that the particular dogmas, orthodoxies, forms of conventional wisdom that your parents, your social milieu, have indoctrinated into you from an early age, there's absolutely no presumption that those beliefs and those ways of conducting oneself are in fact in your best interests, right? In fact, if anything, I mean, I don't think he ever says this, but it seems to be right, that there is a far higher probability that these things are actually bad for you, that they're not actually in your interests, right? And so mindlessly acquiescing in whatever your society has just given to you, it is a way well, it threatens your individual well-being because it hinders the sort of honest self-exploration and consideration of alternatives on which the authentic and free development of your individuality depends, right? It courts a very, very high, simply deferring to what everybody expects of you, right? This courts a very, very high risk of living a lie, right? Spending your entire life living behind an inauthentic mask, right? This, Mill thinks, in the subjection of women, and here Harriet Taylor's arguments are very, very important. This, he thinks, is very often the fate of women under patriarchal conditions, right? They're forced to, or compelled to buy into a certain set of gender roles, and those gender roles are what society expects them to be, but they may not correspond in any way at all to who they really are or what they're capable of, right? And forcing people to hide behind inauthentic masks, take on roles and demeanors that aren't really who they are, right? That's a really powerful way to make human beings suffer, right? Think of a person who is born, let's stipulate that they're gay and that this is just something about them, there's nothing they could do anything about, but they happen to be born into a very, very conservative Christian family that drums into this person from a very early age that homosexual feelings, desires to engage in homosexual sex, are unnatural, disgusting, perverse, wicked, sinful, worthy of being burnt in hell. The epithet faggot, of course, is an implicit reference to being burnt, right? So you should keep that in mind. That's what it means, right? Worthy just to be sort of burnt up in a fire, right? If you're in fact gay and you're raised in that milieu, right, you will internalize a conception of yourself as not like that, right, even if you are. And you will live your life behind an inauthentic mask in which you will assume that what is best for you is in fact not to openly express your sexuality, but rather conform to the heteronormative ideals in your society, say, and marry somebody of the opposite sex and have children and so forth. Now, that's not only a recipe for psychological disorder. Mill, of course, recognizes that too, right? It's going to produce all kinds of kinks and strange behaviors and psychoses and neuroses, and these may require therapy to deal with later on in life. But even more importantly than that, Mill thinks, this precludes fullness of life. It dulls and blunts or withers and starves who you really are, the capacities that you need to mobilize and recruit if you are to live a full and joyful life. And that directly threatens your happiness, right? And again, this connects very, very much with his arguments about the higher pleasures. Mill, I think, rejects in general the proverb that ignorance is bliss, right? He doesn't think ignorance is bliss, or perhaps, to put it slightly more subtly, Mill would say, well, maybe ignorance is a sort of bliss in the sense that turning a blind eye, shutting yourself off from the truth, and doing something else that provides you with sort of lower grade distraction and pleasure. Maybe that's a reasonable strategy, to proceed on a short term basis, right? And maybe it brings you a certain kind of bliss. But if we describe this as bliss, it's a bliss of a very low order. And it's not the kind of higher pleasure that he thinks human beings, for whom things like honesty, knowledge, truth, non-delusion matter for their own sakes. It's not the kind of happiness to which human beings do and should really aspire. Living a lie, indulging illusions, rather than face life as it is honestly and cope with the challenges it faces. That's to fail to thrive as a human being intrinsically, right? That's an absolutely fundamental ingredient in human, as opposed to pig fool happiness. If you want a good illustration of what I think Mill is thinking here, think of the movie Truman, The Truman Show. I hope most of you have seen it. It's a movie in which we imagine a person who's literally born into a really radical reality TV show scenario from birth. Everything that he does is watched by an audience of global TV viewers, but everything that happens to him is in fact inauthentic, right? He lives his entire life on a movie set that he doesn't realize is a movie set. Everyone he interacts with is not a real parent, not a real teacher, not a real first love, but just actors and actresses who are paid to play those roles for the entertainment of this global audience that is watching, right? And of course that means that pretty much everything that Truman experiences in his early life is a lie in a radical sense. It isn't what it seems to be, right? And the lesson of the film, of course, is, and Mill would, I think, have wholeheartedly agreed, is that that is not human happiness. To live under the shadow of that kind of illusion is not to thrive as a human being. And of course, that's one of the things that Truman himself realizes. He attempts and succeeds eventually in liberating himself from the lie that he's living. And we celebrate that, Mill thinks, from the standpoint of human happiness. So he thinks this is still a utilitarian argument. And in general, Mill thinks that we can only protect ourselves against that sort of self-delusion by living in a society whose atmosphere is one that allows people the latitude and space to question who they are, and not just dogmatically and mindlessly, credulously, gullibly follow the model that is given to them by the orthodoxies of their society. Now, there's an obvious objection that all of these arguments raise, one that's very, very pertinent to our current political predicament, and I want to just put this out there because I think it will provide rich grist for your discussion sections this week. You might say, look, Mill seems to be making a prediction here. Looking forward from 1859, he's saying in a relatively repressive Victorian society, if we lift these restrictions, if we have free speech, free association, rich, variegated civil society with lots of diverse options for individuals to pursue, a rich and vigorous media, what will gradually happen is that human beings will tend to become less conformist, more experimental, less dogmatic, less uncritically devoted to the norms that they've been socialized into. They will become less moralistic, less ideologically partisan. They'll become more intellectually humble. They'll become more open-minded, more cerebral, more reflected, less materialistic and consumeristic, and more inclined toward the higher things in life, Mill's higher pleasures, right? But you might say, this would be the objection, okay, so that was a reasonable thing to think in 1859, looking forward, when no society had really practiced anything like Mill's proposal in any systematic way. But we've now had a century or more of experimenting with Mill's proposal. And you shouldn't overlook the fact that Mill's On Liberty has made a powerful impact in especially influencing First Amendment free speech jurisprudence in the United States. A lot of free speech jurisprudence in the United States, First Amendment jurisprudence, has been powerfully shaped by Mill's arguments in On Liberty. So, we've now had a long period, especially in the post-war period in the West, of adopting something like Mill's proposal. But the objection would run, we've learned from experience that actually Mill's prediction is off target. It's not the case that free speech has brought about all of the things that he hoped it would. People in free societies have, the objection would run, actually become just as, if not more, tribal and mindlessly conformist as they were before, right? Eccentricity, sticking your head above the parapet and dissenting is still just as hard, if not harder, in contemporary society than it was before. People are just as herd-like, just as tribal, just as unreflectively ideological, just as mindlessly consumeristic and intellectually lazy as before. So perhaps one might object. We know now that Mill's prediction was naive and in fact off target, right? Let me just give what I take to be Mill's likely response to this. I think he would say, look, my argument isn't a prediction, really. You should think of my argument rather as an ideal. It's describing, ideally, right, what society should look like, right, if it is to fully realize the possibilities for human happiness that are latent within the species, right? And that society would be a free society in which people are not constantly dogged by fear of being different, right? And I think Mill would say, look, I'm not really making a prediction. In fact, Mill explicitly says at various points that the truth will always prevail, even under conditions in which there is freedom of discussion, right? He's not so naive as to think that, you just take a diverse society, throw in a little the salt of freedom of speech and the First Amendment and so forth, shake vigorously, and then the truth and enlightenment and wisdom will automatically prevail, right? I don't think Mill is so naive as to think that. In fact, he explicitly says that that's not the case, right? So Mill might, I think, respond by saying, and you should think about this, I'm not really predicting automatic success, right? But I am describing the ideal at which we should aim, and that ideal is really unthinkable in the absence of a commitment to freedom in my sense, right? And I think Mill would then go on the offensive and say, look, all of the things that people are concerned about today, right? Epistemic bubbles, mindless herd-like conformity, ideological partisanship and tribalism, alternative facts, right? All of the misinformation that is available and accelerating online. These are real problems, right? And we need to address them. But indulging the temptation to restrict speech and thought further is a losing gambit, right? That would betray the ideal and lead us further away from what we're attempting to realize. Mill, I think, would say, look, yes, we have to face up to these tendencies, recognize them for what they are, and do what we can to correct them. But in the end of the day, the only way to do that is to point them out. And the only way we can point them out in a way that will have an impact on others is to successfully argue that this is a problem. And that they are really to our collective detriment. And that's only going to be something that is really possible under the ideal conditions that he thinks he's described in chapters 2 and 3 of his book. So I think what he would say is it's up to us, right? It's not something that we can, it's not a problem we can solve structurally by trying to restrict freedom, right? The only conditions under which agents can do it well, can correct these tendencies, are ones in which we follow Mill's prescription, in which we take individuality seriously and resist the temptation to try to restrict its open expression. And I think it's particularly pertinent to note, because this is, of course, very, very important today. It's important on campus and in other areas of life too. Mill is really unenthusiastic about indulging a kind of moralizing censoriousness, right? The kind of thing that travels today under the label of cancel culture. The tendency to say, well, we don't even need to listen to these people because we already know that these people are evil or wicked, right? They're already so bigoted that we don't even need to pay any attention to their arguments, right? That, Mill would say, is precisely the kind of thing that not only will fail to cure the disease that we're trying to remedy, it will actually reinforce the disease. He says this very clearly on page 192, for example. He talks about the worst offense in this area, which can be committed by polemicists, is to stigmatize those who hold the contrary opinion as bad and immoral men, right? Unmeasured vituperation employed on the side of the prevailing opinion really does deter people from professing contrary opinions and from listening to those who profess them. So the conclusion that he reaches here is that we should condemn anyone, and I'm quoting here, on whichever side of the argument he places himself, in whose mode of advocacy either want of candor or malignity or bigotry or intolerance of feeling manifest themselves. But we should never infer these vices from the side which a person takes, though it be the contrary side of the question to our own, right? So I think it's fairly clear that Mill would be very, very hostile to these sorts of elements in contemporary society, this tendency to want to indulge cancel culture and not listen to people just because we've already decided that anyone who takes the kind of position that they're defending is already too immoral or wicked or bad to take seriously and not worth listening to. That, Mill thinks, is always a losing gambit. It indulges what he says, the deep slumber of a decided opinion. And the whole point of a free society, he says, is to wake people up out of that slumber. And the one way to keep us asleep, he thinks, in a way, he's sort of saying wokeness requires you not to be woke, right? He's saying we have to resist the temptation to decide in advance that certain arguments are not worth listening to because we've decided that the speaker is too bigoted and too immoral to be worth listening to. So lots here for you to think about. I'm pretty sympathetic, as you can probably tell, to Mill's general line here, but I don't want to dogmatically assert it. You will have, I think, some very interesting conversations about this in your discussion section, and I look forward to hearing from some of you about how those conversations go. Okay, 30 minutes left. Let me now try to talk about the harm principle itself, which is often widely misunderstood. So I'm going to try to make some clarifications of how I think Mill conceives of this principle and what it actually entails. The first thing you've got to grasp about the harm principle, which Mill assumes is primarily relevant to decision-making about the law, right? I mean, what the harm principle really does is to restrict the way in which we argue about the imposition of legal interferences, the use of the law to restrict individual freedom. And what the harm principle does, or the best way to understand it, I submit, is to think of it as a principle that allocates burdens of proof in arguments that people make in favor of legislating against certain kinds of personal activity, right? And the way in which it allocates burdens of proof is by excluding from consideration absolutely certain kinds of arguments as counting in favor of legal limitations on individual freedom. And it insists that the only arguments that we should even consider are arguments about averting harms to third parties. That's what the harm principle does. Notice three categories of arguments that Mill's harm principle very clearly rules out of court. Somebody presents an argument for a law in these terms. The harm principle says, thank you, no doubt that's an interesting argument, but it's not relevant. We shouldn't consider these arguments. We should set them aside and think about the matter in terms of harm to others, right? So what are these three types of arguments? Well, one category of arguments that the harm principle excludes are arguments for restricting individual liberty on moralistic grounds, right? What's often called legal moralism, right? So a legal moralist argument is an argument that takes the form, we should pass a law against X, we should criminalize X, we should coerce people who engage in X just because it is or thought to be immoral, vicious, wicked, sinful, right? So if we say, let's pass a law against consuming alcohol because consuming alcohol is vicious or wicked or sinful. It says in the Bible we shouldn't do this, right? We shouldn't intoxicate ourselves, right? So Puritan arguments about getting drunk, right? Any argument that takes that form for restricting the consumption of alcohol, the harm principle will rule out. Because we're not talking about what the harm principle says we should be talking about, namely harm to third parties, right? So it would be different if we were talking about, say, drunk driving, right? If somebody said, well, we should leave people free to consume alcohol, but we can legitimately restrict people from driving a car while they're drunk. Why? Because people who drive cars while drunk are dangers to others, right? They're more likely to kill other people or to injure other people. That argument is okay, but it's not a moralistic argument. It's an argument about harm, right? So any argument that says some activity is worthy to be criminalized just because we think it's immoral or intrinsically bad from an ethical point of view, right? That's an argument that the harm principle rules out absolutely. No such argument should be allowed to count. Second category, paternalist arguments, right? These are often hard to distinguish from moralistic arguments, but they're different in that a paternalist argument doesn't condemn a certain activity because it's immoral. It condemns an activity because the person who engages in it is being stupid or imprudent or foolish, right? So if we say, for example, of a person that they shouldn't consume certain kinds of drugs because it's bad for them, right? Or they shouldn't engage in certain kinds of sexual experimentation because it will in fact give them sexually transmitted diseases or something like that, right? That's a paternalist argument. It's not really a moral argument because you're not saying there's anything intrinsically wrong with it. No, it's not intrinsically unethical. We're just trying to protect people against the consequences, the negative consequences for them of engaging in the relevant activity. So the standard form of a paternalist argument is that some act should be prohibited because the agent who engages in that act will be worse off themselves if they engage in it, right? Now, it's true that paternalist arguments talk about harm, right? But the harm principle, as Mill states it, makes it clear that it's not just any old harm that counts. It's harm to others. It's harm to third parties, right? So it's the to others part of Mill's formula that rules out paternalist arguments, because what we're concerned about when we justify legal restrictions on paternalistic grounds is the harms to the agent themselves. And those sorts of arguments are also ruled out of court by the harm principle, because they're not arguments that avert harms to third parties, to others. No argument of that kind the harm principle will countenance. Thirdly, and somewhat surprisingly, people don't, I think, make as much of this as they should. The harm principle also rules out of court direct utilitarian policy making that takes the form we should prohibit Z, because by enacting a prohibition against Z, we will be doing something that will actually promote overall welfare, will maximize the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It's perhaps really surprising that Mill should rule that out, because as a utilitarian you might expect him to say, look, if you know that some law is in fact going to lead to the best possible outcome overall, it's going to promote overall happiness, then why the hell shouldn't you pass such a law? But the harm principle has the effect of basically saying utilitarian considerations are relevant in lawmaking only negatively, right? Because what we're really concerned to do when we use the law to restrict personal freedom is to prevent harm, right? Rather than to promote happiness. And I take it that the point of Mill's taking that line is to say that the promotion of happiness is something that we ought to leave individuals to work out in civil society for themselves, in the kind of rich discursive environment of challenge, of debate, of experimentation that he thinks will be left to them in a free society. So notice that Mill's harm principle rules out a certain kind of direct utilitarian technocratic policy making that takes as justified any law that will promote overall well-being. No such law should be countenanced according to the harm principle, because the harm principle has the effect of saying the only laws that are worthy to be enforced are those laws that will prevent bads from occurring, prevent harms, rather than considering laws that will actually promote overall welfare, even if they produce a certain amount of harm. So keep that in mind. Now, notice, this is where things get a little bit tricky. Of course, there are going to be many possible arguments that one might give for the same legal provision. And so some are going to be consistent with the harm principle, others not. So when you ask whether a proposed legal enactment falls foul of the harm principle, you can't usually answer that question just by looking at the content of the prohibition. You have to look at the grounds that people are giving for it, right? So think about things like suicide, censorship of pornography, restrictions on the adoption of children by same-sex couples, right? Take pornography as just one example, right? Some people urge the censorship and restriction of pornography on moralistic grounds. They say, well, the problem is that men, because it's primarily men, who consume pornography, they're bad people, right? They're indulging sinful appetites of various sorts. And the reason to censor pornography is to protect people against unsavory, unethical, vicious, forms of life. And that kind of argument, the harm principle is going to just shrug its shoulders and say, well, you haven't told us anything interesting yet. You haven't told us anything that needs to be considered because you haven't talked about harms at all. If, on the other hand, as some radical feminists following Catherine MacKinnon argue, if you make the claim that, well, the problem about pornography is that its production and consumption is actually causally complicit in exposing especially women to certain kinds of harm, right? Rape culture, sexual assault, domestic abuse, right? If you think there's a causal connection between the consumption of pornography by, again, especially men, if you think there's a causal connection between that and the exposure of women to very serious harms of a sexual or sexually related variety, right? Then you're making an argument that the harm principle allows us to consider, because now you're in the right ballpark. Now you're making a claim about harms to others, and I'll come back to that case in a moment, because you might then say, well, does that mean that the harm principle implies, as indeed Catherine MacKinnon and radical feminists argue, that we ought to consider the censorship of pornography on these grounds, right? I think the answer is going to turn out to be no, but that requires us to appreciate some other things about the harm principle, which I'll get to in a moment, right? So each of these sorts of claims can be defended on paternalist or moralist grounds, but you can also imagine people arguing that these activities should be regulated on the grounds that they are harmful to others. And the way the harm principle is supposed to work is it's supposed to disallow the paternalist, moralistic, or direct utilitarian arguments for them, and require us only to consider the arguments that bringing before us claims about averting serious harms to others, right? And so you can't usually decide, if you're applying the harm principle, whether a law is fit to be enforced just by looking at its content. You have to consider the justifications that are being used. And that's where the restrictions of the harm principle kick in. Note, though, this is really important. Lots of people go wrong here, and this is related to what I was hinting at with the censorship of pornography example. The fact that we're talking about the right sort of thing, the fact that the harm principle will permit arguments for a certain law to be taken seriously because they're arguments of the right form, they are about harm to others and the prevention of harm to others, right? That doesn't mean that any time anything causes any sort of harm to others, that means that we're compelled to pass a law against it, right? All the harm principle does is to say that we get to consider whether the law is justified, all things considered. So satisfying the harm principle for Mill, again, is really important. I can't stress this enough. Satisfying the harm principle is a necessary but not sufficient condition for justifying limitations on personal liberty, right? So Mill is perfectly aware that there are lots of things that cause local harms, right? He gives the example, for example, at one point of competitive exams for professional positions, right? Suppose you have a meritocratic exam that you have to get a certain score on or do sufficiently well on in order to qualify for a position in the civil service, say, right? And suppose I want to get a job in the civil service, and you and I are both competing with each other for one remaining job in the civil service, and it depends on the score we get on this meritocratic civil service exam, right? And you're just much better than me, or you revise for the exam much more effectively than me. And because you revise much more effectively, you do better on the exam, you get the position, and I don't, right? Mill's perfectly aware that harms me, right? And so he asks the question, well, should we then not have competitive exams that will predictably cause harms to people who aren't as good at certain things as others, right? And of course, he's going to say, yes, there's at least a prima facie case for interference here, but actually, in overall, right, the benefits of having meritocratic practices, even if they're going to harm some people, that's not sufficient, all things considered, to justify a restriction here, because some kinds of harms will in fact produce a net good, and that's the case here. So by itself, the harm principle actually determines rather little. Its main purpose is negative. It mainly serves to exclude certain factors as irrelevant in deciding whether we should pass a law that restrict a person's liberty. So once the threshold set by the harm principle is met, we then face a further set of questions, right? Whether on balance, all things considered, considering the harms and benefits as fully and impartially as we can, we then have to face the question of whether on balance it's a good thing for the law to interfere. But by itself, the harm principle isn't going to answer that further question. It just opens up what Mill thinks is going to be a propitious discussion of whether the costs and benefits work out so that actually it is worth our while restricting liberty for the sake of preventing very, very serious harms. And I'll say a little bit more about how that's supposed to work in a moment. You might say, well, does this mean that the harm principle is just a boring, uncontroversial principle, right? You might say, well, okay, fair enough. If it's just setting this negative necessary condition and isn't itself a sufficient condition for deciding whether a law is worthy to be enforced, it seems to be almost no principle at all. It tells us almost nothing. And you might then think that the harm principle is so uncontroversial that Mill is saying here virtually nothing. And to push back against that, I want to say a couple of things. I mean, one thing to say is that, at least with regard to paternalism, in our society, we are prepared to accept forms of paternalism that the harm principle would, in fact, I think, rule out, right? So think about the requirement that you get a prescription in order to use certain kinds of drugs. Or think about the argument that we should prohibit access to certain kinds of drugs or substances that are perceived to be addictive and that will therefore harm the people who use them by locking them into self-defeating addictions, right? Or laws against laws that require you to wear seatbelts while driving a car, or crash helmets while you're on a motorbike. What about laws that impose waiting periods on contracts entered into under the influence of a high-pressure sales pitch, or laws against consensual murder? These are all laws that we, broadly speaking, accept, but they're all accepted and justified in our society on, broadly speaking, paternalistic grounds, right? I mean, think of the waiting periods on contracts, right? You get bullied by an overzealous car salesman or mattress salesman into signing a contract, right? And our own stupidity, our own willingness to be influenced by the techniques of the salesperson leaves us in a position where we make a foolish decision. We sign a foolish contract, right? But we allow people to back out of contracts under these circumstances to protect them against their own stupid decisions, right? That's a paternalist argument, right? And you might think, well, that makes a good deal of sense, actually, because, we don't want to be just locked into contracts that we foolishly enter because, we feel intimidated and bullied in the moment by a high-pressure sales pitch, right? And if we accept that kind of argument for those kinds of restrictions, then we're accepting paternalist arguments that the harm principle is actually going to rule out. I think it's also worth mentioning here that the harm principle doesn't rule out public intervention in economic life. Mill says trade is a social act. And what he's pointing out there is that economic activities have potentially harmful effects on third parties. As I pointed out in an earlier lecture, Mill certainly was a proponent of free trade, but there's nothing in the harm principle that rules out regulation in economic activity that prevents third-party harms, right? If we're worried that leaving the free market unregulated will cause deprivation, poverty, or the denial of economic opportunities to disadvantaged groups, that's all argumentation for regulation that the harm principle is going to allow, because these are arguments that conform to the harm principle's logic, right? Because what we're concerned about there is harm to third parties, right? So since some people think, libertarians, for example, think that we should never, Lockean libertarians, that we should never contemplate regulating the economy for these kinds of reasons, right? The harm principle is clearly at odds with that libertarian position, so you should keep that in mind, and that's potentially controversial. The anti-moralism of the harm principle is also potentially controversial in a way that I think few people recognize. I think most people take it for granted that a reason to pass laws against murder and theft and fraud is that murder, theft, and fraud are immoral. They're wicked, right? They violate ethical behavior or norms of ethical behavior, right? But notice that Mill's harm principle says, well, that's not a valid reason to pass a law against murder. Right? We're not allowed to restrict murder and theft just on the grounds that murderers are wicked people. And you might ask yourself, do you really want to say that? Of course, that's not to say that Mill doesn't think that we shouldn't have laws against murder and theft. What he's saying is the only thing about murder and theft and fraud that are relevant for justifying laws against them is the fact that they cause material harms, right? They damage the interests of others. That's the only reason. But the idea that we should, as it were, take a moral stand against murderers because we regard murderers as wicked people, right? That's an argument that Mill says should play no role in our considered view about whether the law should regulate them. And that's a potentially radical claim, since I suspect a lot of you would want to say to the contrary, that the immorality of murder is a legitimate reason to restrict murderers. More broadly, isn't there something anti-democratic about this? I mean, doesn't self-government require some legal moralism? Why shouldn't a society use its privileges as a democratic society to encode into the law its community values, right? If the Irish, because they're committed to Catholicism for the most part, if they want to encode into their laws a kind of pro-life position, I mean, that's what they used to do. They've recently changed because of their recent referendum. But if they want to do that, isn't that a perfectly legitimate thing for a self-governing democratic society to do? Well, Mill's harm principle says no, right? You can't do that even if the vast majority of people in a society believe certain sorts of actions are immoral. That can't be a valid reason for restricting people's liberty to perform them. Now, of course, the obvious question that arises at this point is, well, what harms does Mill count? Doesn't he leave this a little bit vague? And many of you will, of course, immediately want to say, well, you know, there are so many possible harms. Actually, this is just a recipe for the extensive regulation of almost everything, because you can always find some kind of harm that some kind of activity causes. And so doesn't the harm principle actually commit us to over-regulation? And I don't think that's Mill's intention. That's not to say that he isn't vulnerable to criticism on this sort, and you should think about it. But before you reach that negative conclusion, you should keep in mind 5 points about his view. And I'm just going to go through these 5 points and then leave the discussion there. Here they are in advance. Mill insists that in order to justify, all things considered, the legal enforcement of some restriction on personal liberty, the harms that we're trying to prevent have to be serious and outweighing, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. Mill thinks, and remember the point about allocating burdens of proof, Mill's harm principle says, look, it's the burden of proof here lies with the proponent of restrictions on individual liberty to prove sufficient harm. And if you can't do that, then you shouldn't pass the law, right? And I'll come to that in the case of pornography in a moment, because I think you'll appreciate some of the strengths of his position. Claims about harms have to be fairly definite. They have to be clear harms. You can't make sort of rough and ready abstract or ideological claims about harms. That protects his argument, I think, against certain kinds of misunderstandings and criticisms. I'll get to that in a moment. And you should also finally keep in mind all of the things that Bentham says about when legal enforcement itself can cause serious social harms, and so will often, as he puts it, be unprofitable or maybe needless or inefficacious, to use some of Bentham's categories. Mill is taking on board and presupposing all of that. And so let me talk about each of these in turn and why I think they deserve consideration and help you to see some of the strengths of Mill's position, and I'll leave it at that for today. So, taking the first, harms have to be serious and outweighing, right? Again, I talked about the case of the meritocratic exam earlier, right? The mere fact that some activity causes some harm, right? Again, that gets a proposal in the door. It's worthy then of thinking about, well, maybe we should pass a law against it, right? But the question is going to be, and here the utilitarian background is important, right? The fact that something causes some localized or trivialized or relatively trivial harm in some areas of life is not the same as saying that thing is harmful, all things considered, because sometimes things that are locally harmful actually yield net benefits to society at large. And if that's the case, then the case for passing a law against the relevant activity will weaken on on Mill's view. Right? And in fact, if you think about his arguments about free discussion, they are often of exactly that form. I mean, Mill is perfectly aware that offensive speech, right, racist speech, right, bigoted comments, the use of racial epithets, for example, that's deeply offensive and harmful, right? No question about it. Mill accepts that it's harmful. But whether that justifies restrictions on racist speech depends ultimately for Mill on whether the local harms that are caused by offensive speech are so serious as to outweigh any benefits that we might obtain from having a society in which free discussion is upheld. And in general, his view is that actually the overwhelming benefits of free discussion are such that it's better for us to tolerate the localized harms of racist speech for the wider benefit of having the opportunity to discuss and correct them in free and open discussion. So his point here is that, yes, we would protect certain individuals from the harm of offense that they experience from being subjected to racist abuse, but restricting speech in that way, restricting discussion in that way, carries a much, much larger opportunity cost, because we would thereby undermine the conditions under which free discussion and all of its utilitarian benefits, as he sees them anyway, can be garnered for society. All right, so keep that in mind. It's not enough just to show that there's some harm. You have to show that the harms that you're trying to prevent are serious enough and outweighing enough to be worth the price of a restriction of freedom. And since restricting freedom will bring the harm of denying societies the opportunity to engage in experiments and living and so forth, and acquire a more rational attitude to one's own opinions and beliefs, that's often an even greater harm that we need to take into consideration. So think about that. Second point. This is really, really important, right? And again, go back to the example of the feminist argument about pornography, right? Mill says, yes, if the feminists want to argue that pornography is causally complicit in rape culture and exposing women to all of the harms of domestic abuse and sexual assault, yeah, that's a valid reason to consider restricting pornography, right? But, Mill is going to say, right, in order to justify a law censoring pornography, all things considered, we have to be sure, right, that restriction will in fact protect women against those harms, right? And that puts the burden on the proponent to show that that's the case. And I think Mill would probably say that that's not clear enough to justify a restriction, right? Because there's a lot of causal steps that go from the consumption of pornography to the exposure of women to sexual assault, right? And certainly there's evidence on the other side, or arguments that you could make. You could say, well, actually, maybe it's the case that letting a potentially abusive man use pornography as a kind of outlet for sexual frustration that might otherwise it manifests itself in terms of violence against women, right? Maybe it's actually beneficial to allow men to consume pornography. It's not obvious, right, that the causal relationship between the consumption of pornography and propensity to rape, for example, is clear and watertight, right? And if you can't show, right, that there's a tight causal connection between those two things, then the proponent of a law against a law censoring pornography will have failed to show that this is a law that we should enforce, right? Another example would be, sometimes conservatives argue that having same-sex adoption is bad for children, right? And Mill is going to say, well, maybe it is, right? But is it really empirically plausible to believe that it's that much worse to be raised in a family with two male parents than it is to be raised with a family by a male and a female parent? Is it obvious empirically that one or other of these tends towards greater harm? I mean, here I'm speaking for myself. I mean, I see plenty of really, really ill-adjusted people who've been raised in heterosexual families by parents who've done an extremely bad job, right? There's no particular it's not obvious anyway, that harms to children are any more or less likely if they're raised in a heterosexual family than they are in a homosexual family. And if that's unclear, right, if we're not certain that there's a tendency for these harms to be more strongly experienced by children raised in homosexual families, then we have to say this law is not worthy to be passed. Contrast, I mean, some societies have had so-called ugly man laws, right? The laws that say, look, really ugly people shouldn't be allowed to go around. I mean, this sounds fantastic, but it's the case that some societies have had laws like this. Right? If you have really ugly people with deformities, for example, it's offensive to others to have to confront such people, right? So we should make them stay home, because we don't want other people to experience the harm of being confronted with offensively ugly people, right? And Mill would say, well, that's a stupid reason. I mean, the harms involved here are really not outweighing when you consider the harms that quote unquote ugly people are being asked to incur just to spare other people the mild discomfort of seeing deformed people on the streets, right? This argument isn't going to, get to first base, right? But contrast that with a law that says, well, we can keep people in their homes because they're carrying a lethal disease, a case which is on my slide because I used to use it in years before, but of course now, it takes on particular significance in the light of COVID, right? So the burden is always on the proponent of restrictions to prove sufficient harm, and if that proof is not forthcoming or easy to establish, then Mill's considered position is to say we shouldn't pass the law, right? So that's one of the ways in which Mill's argument is protected, at least potentially, against this charge that this is going to result in the over-criminalization of everything, right? Because you've got to have a really cast-iron case that the harms are real and that there's a causal story to tell about how the imposition of the restriction will spare people the relevant kinds of harms. Mill also says, look, claims about harms must not be overly abstract or generalized. There have to be clear people who stand to suffer in significant numbers from our failure to enforce some legal rule or restriction. You have to be able to show that there's concrete harms that we're actually averting by passing this law. And nebulous or merely metaphorical claims about harms to abstract entities like the social fabric, right? They're not going to count, right? You have to show that there's actual concrete flesh and blood harm. Need to calm down. Sorry, because I'm running out of time. That's why. They don't count, right? So if somebody says, look, a law that outlaws circumcision, right, which certainly strikes me as a reasonable law. I mean, why? I mean, everybody gets upset about female genital mutilation, but somehow circumcision gets a free pass, and I'm not quite sure why. If somebody says, yeah, but look, there are important religious traditions, like the Jewish tradition, that you would be harming if you outlawed circumcision, right? Mill would say, well, who cares about a tradition? Right? A tradition isn't a person. A tradition is just an abstract cultural entity. And we're not interested in harms to such nebulous things, right? We're interested in harms to actual flesh and blood people. And you might say, lopping bits, sources of parts of a human body that have a very, very large number of highly sensitive nerve endings that are potentially sources of great pleasure, allowing society to just lop these bits of flesh off them just for the sake of some religious dogma, right? That's not a valid reason to impose those kinds of harms on human beings. So that's something you should also consider. And then keep in mind, too, that this is the Bentham stuff about needless, unprofitable, or inefficacious punishments. Legal enforcement itself always causes serious harms, right? Mill is assuming that because he's a utilitarian, legal punishment is always an evil because it always involves the infliction of suffering and pain, right? It's worth imposing these kinds of costs only when, to put it in Benthamite terms, doing so will be efficacious or profitable in the long run, right? And you should keep in mind that apart from the harms imposed by laws that restrict people's freedom themselves, there are all sorts of other costs that come with enforcement, right? If you have a law against something, if you get the courts involved, there's all sorts of other stuff, right? You have to subpoena people and put them on the witness stand and make them say things that they might be uncomfortable saying, right? Police investigations are often highly intrusive, right? These all cause harms, and all of that has to be outweighed for legal coercion to be okay. And similarly, when legal enforcement is needless, inefficacious, or unprofitable, other forms of sanctioning conduct may be available. And Mill is clear that the normal use of legal penalties is to prevent those social harms that take the form of violations of basic rights to security of person and property. Other ways in which people can abuse, wrong, or mistreat each other may be better sanctioned not by law, but by relying on informal social penalties, disapproval, criticism, shaming, shunning. I mentioned the Me Too movement in my lectures on Bentham. And in these kinds of cases, it might be better, Mill could say, rather than invoking the harm principle to justify legal restrictions, we can perhaps deal with it better by mobilizing the power of speech to name and shame people in open public discussion than it is to actually involve the system of law in restricting personal freedom, right? And so in those kinds of cases, the case for legal restrictions of personal freedom may not seem justified, right? So these are all considerations you should take into consideration. Okay, I have to stop here because I've run out of time and I'm getting all hot and bothered. So let's stop there. Lots here, I'm sure, to power some, I'm sure, very interesting discussions in your discussion meetings this week. So good luck with that. I look forward to hearing how it goes. So have a lovely week. Bye.